I just accepted a new position, and I wasn't going to do it unless I had real authority. I only report to the president. That's the only way. I am on the executive leadership team, so those are the things that I knew I needed in terms of influence and power. There's no way you can influence any culture if you're not at the decision-making table.
My conversation about women in leadership with Reverend Michelle D. Williams on Make Room, Black Leaders in the 21st Century begins now. Welcome to Make Room, Black Leaders of the 21st Century. I'm your host, Pastor Kenneth M. Young. Make Room is an opportunity to help define what leadership means, particularly in our Black leaders. How do leaders lead? What do good leaders look like? And what qualities define great leadership? This episode, I'm so excited and happy to introduce the Reverend Michelle D. Williams. Reverend Williams is a writer, speaker, preacher, and entrepreneur. For over 20 years, Reverend Williams has worked with people during some of the most formative and stressful seasons of life, beginning as a social worker with at-risk populations, serving as a pastor, walking through life's transitions, working as an advisor and mentor to undergraduate college students, navigating tumultuous racial, cultural conflicts, and most recently as a dean at a graduate seminary. Having served in various pastoral ministry roles, Reverend Michelle appreciates the legacy of godly women and men in her family that have richly impacted her and her life and her ministry, whether it is within a church setting or within the hallowed halls of academia. Shepherding people, programs, and policies require wisdom and grace. I'll say that again. It requires wisdom and grace. We all need that today. These two attributes are the cornerstone of Michelle's leadership approach. Reverend Williams is co-author of Diversity Playbook, Recommendations and Guidance for Christian Organizations. She is a certified diversity executive and CEO of Shalom Consultant. We say congratulations to you today as she starts a new role in the few weeks to come as Vice President of DEI at Firefly Children and Family Alliance. We're so excited about that, and we're so excited to have Reverend Williams with us on today. Thank you, Reverend Williams, for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Pastor Kenneth.
I'm excited about this conversation about Black women leadership in higher education. Mm-hmm. But before we jump into that, I just want to hear and give our audience just a little bit more of your background and tell us about who you are and where you come from.
Okay, well, thank you for that gracious introduction. I always like to tell people that I'm a daughter and a survivor of the church. I say that because I'm fourth generation Church of God in Christ. I came out of my mother's womb singing in a choir. And I start with the church because the church is where my early leadership skills were developed. Like many of us, I learned public speaking skills and confidence in the church. Those Easter Sunday speeches and reading scripture and learning to teach younger kids in Sunday school was all really formational for me. So by the time I actually preached my first sermon at 18, I was very comfortable speaking in front of a crowd. The other thing that really shaped me growing up was the fact that we moved around a lot. By the time I was 16, I had lived in 9 different places. My dad was a Kmart manager and then district manager. And everywhere we went, we were one of the only Black families. And so Monday through Friday, I kind of had to navigate primarily white spaces in school, but my mom was very, very good about finding a Black church where we can connect with it. So on the weekends, I was kind of immersed in Black culture. So at an early age, I learned how to live biculturally. I learned how to be a bridge person and how to kind of bridge cultural gaps from those experiences growing up. Fast forward a little bit, and I went to undergrad and then decided to go to graduate school in Tulsa, where, and this is where I felt like I really accepted my calling and stepped into a youth pastor, associate pastor role in the church. And for me, that meant I had to unlearn some conditioning in order to accept that calling and that leadership responsibility. And I'll talk about that a little later on, but all of that was just formative in me trying to figure out who I was, right? Now I had this position of leadership, and I didn't really know if I could accept it. And when I did, there was those insecurities and those old scripts running. But I served in that position and was offered an associate pastor position. And then there was an awful church split. And so I actually was offered the senior pastor position at 29 years old. And I had the good sense to decline it because I certainly wasn't ready. And I was so wounded at that point. I was about sick of people. And so I moved to Indianapolis and took care of my dad. And this is when I decided I wanted to go to seminary. I needed a little more education and a kind of a firm theological grasp, so that when I had those questions or those doubts about my calling, I could actually have this theological foundation to stand on. So I went to seminary. I kind of did it backwards, right? Accepted my call and served in ministry and then decided to go to seminary. And it was there that I was introduced to higher ed. I was walking across the valley of this institution, and there was the undergrad side on one side of the valley, and then on the other side was the seminary. I was walking across the valley, and a gentleman stopped me. And he said, "Hey, are you Michelle?" And I'm thinking, okay, yeah. And he said, "I have this position that I think that you would be perfect for." And so I went through the process and I accepted the position as the director of multicultural student services. And Pastor Kenneth, let me tell you, I didn't have any like cross-cultural skills training. My background was social work and ministry. But those are the two things that I needed in that role. That first year in that position in higher ed was the year that Barack Obama was elected president. And in this small college campus in Indiana, we had nooses being hung. We had the N-word written. I mean, it was just trial by fire that first year. So I was grateful for that social work background and that ministry background. So I served in that role for about a few years, and then was offered another promotion. So I was given the leadership of the Cultural Resource Center on campus. So I was the director of that, and then ended up being the assistant dean of students as well. And so I carry both of those hats. And just really, there was a lot going on at that time in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion on Christian college campuses. And I wanted a change. I thought, okay, I need to do something different. I knew I wanted to marry my love for the church with my love for student development. And so I saw an ad for a dean of students at a seminary. And I thought, oh, this is perfect. And accepted that role, moved cross country, and served in that role for about 4 years. And at that point, I was completely burnt out with God's people. And and higher ed in general. And I mean, my body told me that. So I developed, I got sick. It was like, okay, you need to take a break. And so I went on a sabbatical. I did some traveling and I wrote a book. And so, yeah, that kind of brings us current to where we are today.
Yes, thank you. I mean, that was a whole lot. So
I know.
I want to try to transition it to, the topic for this podcast, this episode for this podcast today is, Black women and the role of leadership in higher education. And it sounds like from your background that you have a lot of experience in that, but I want to kind of get into considering the buzzword diversity. What was it like being thrown into those situations where they looked at you to kind of give them not only leadership, but give an answer?
Yeah, it was and is always humbling. It's always humbling, scary, and it's like put up or shut up moment, right? Even I talked about in 2007, 2008, the transition into a role when Barack Obama was elected president. Like that is when you see nooses hung on campus in response to something that's happening in the political sphere. That's like newsworthy. You got to do something quickly, or the reputation of the whole institution, And so for me, in my background, it's like, okay, I need help. And so not being afraid to ask for help, like I literally said, we got to get somebody in here, because it was my first year, like literally 2 months on the job, right? So we called in a consultant. And for me, that was the best thing I've ever done, because that consultant to this day is one of my mentors. And she came in, and she was a Black woman as well. And I watched her give guidance to the board, give guidance to the president, give guidance to the student leadership team, and me, right? So everyone had access to this consultant. And for me, that high level of crisis intervention was what I needed to see to help shape my leadership skills. So yeah, it's humbling, it's scary, it's you learn on your feet, and hopefully you ask for help. And that, that's kind of been my motto going forward in terms of leadership in higher education. And that's not easy to do all the time, Pastor Kenneth, because ego gets in the way, right? So asking for help, it's like, okay, well, you want to be seen as a subject matter expert. And in many ways you are, right? You are the only person they're looking to. But knowing your boundaries and knowing where you're deficient, I think is important for anyone in leadership.
Wow. I want to ask you the questions about being in those boardroom settings. And I know you're not able to share specifics, but can you give the audience an experience of what it means to be that Black woman who's sitting in the room, that may be the only Black woman that's there? Are there times where you shrink back and feel like, I can't really say what needs to be said? Are there like jokes that are made that you have to laugh at that are not funny and you find it to be disgraceful? Are there moments like that where you're saying, this just feels icky just being here and not being able to have some real truth-telling moments?
Yeah. There was one particular instance, we were talking about prioritization, and that's a word that I've come to hate in higher ed, where you're trying to prioritize what's most important and what's most on mission, and you're trying to figure out what to cut, right? And the thing that was on the table was one of my areas of responsibility. It's like, wait a minute, we say we want to be a global place and you're cutting international student service. Wait a minute, so it didn't make sense. And I was that mantra in my mind that a budget is a moral document kept ringing, right? And I'm thinking, wow, I'm seeing where your priorities lie. You say you want to be diverse and you say you want to be a global place, but you're cutting this thing that's near and dear. And so I had to speak up in that moment. It was so uncomfortable. But the burden of being the person who I knew had to answer the questions when I walked out of there, right, was on me. I was like, wait a minute, all the questions, all the concerns, all the tears are going to come to my desk. You're making this decision and you're removed from this decision. And so that was a hard moment. It was a hard moment of me deciding that I have to step up. And so I stepped up, I voiced my opinion. In the end, they still decided to cut, and I still had to be the one, but I could go back to those folks and say, I advocated for you, and there are other times when I have sat there and I have bit my tongue and I have regretted it. You walk out and you're like, oh man, I should have said something. And so I tried to do it after the fact. And in some of those after the fact meetings, that was helpful, and I'm grateful. I think that was grace in some of those instances. But yeah, you have those moments where, man, should I speak up now? And I have to rely on discernment to say, okay, is this the moment where I'm going to fight this battle, or are we going to, we're going to just sit here for a minute and bite our tongue?
Wow. So let's dive a little bit deeper, because you're dealing with DEI now. And again, that has been this kind of a thing everybody needs all of a sudden. And we can see this as an outcome of what happened in racial justice issues that have been brought up since George Floyd. We're seeing, cities open up this position. We're seeing universities, institutions, of course, companies, nonprofits are all saying we need DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, personnel to help us make wise choices. But articles have also been written to say that sometimes people who are in these positions don't have the power to actually change the narrative or the culture.
Yes.
Do you find this to happen in higher ed, in particular Christian education?
Okay. Yeah, for sure. I was in a position when I first started where I reported to a vice president of student life. So my role was embedded in student life. And, in higher ed, those are not the people with the power, right? Student affairs professionals are considered the people who babysit the kids, right? And so if you're not a faculty member, or if you're not in administration, your level of influence is decreasing. And so really, I did not have a position of power. When I became the director of the Cultural Resource Center, that was a more institutional role, and I actually had the ear of the provost, who was on our diversity committee. And so that's where I kind of started leveraging those power moments. And I had to be strategic. And I think people who are in those positions where they don't have as much influence have to be strategic about who you have on your committees and who you have access to. And so making sure you have somebody who has authority and power that you have the ear of is so important. And so that's one of the things I've had to do. Fast forward to today and what you're talking about in terms of these companies and everybody wanting to appear to be diverse and inclusive, it has been challenging as a consultant to identify who is really serious about it. And so I actually, my colleague and I, I wrote a book with, we have an assessment, a readiness, diversity readiness assessment. So you say you're ready. Let's see if you're ready. And as a consultant, I have the opportunity to decide I'm not going to take you as a client. Like, yeah, no, you're not ready. I'm not coming. But for people walking into these positions, you have to know the questions to ask. And so I just accepted a new position, and I wasn't going to do it unless I had real authority. I only report to the president. That's the only way. I am on the executive leadership team, so those are the things that I knew I needed in terms of influence and power. There's no way you can influence any culture if you're not at the decision-making table. So yeah, you have to know the questions you ask, the questions to ask before you accept these positions, because otherwise it's frustrating. It is really, it's almost futile.
Yeah, I can see that. And I appreciate you saying that, because I think a lot of us who may be younger are looking at these positions and saying, I think I have something to give and to offer, but don't quite understand the negotiating part before accepting a position. Mm-hmm. You said something earlier I want to kind of go back to. You talked about a mentor. Mm. I think all leaders need good mentors.
Yeah.
What would you say to younger Reverend Williams? And the other question would be, what do you think an older Reverend Williams is going to need as she leads forward?
That's a great question. What I'd say to younger Reverend Williams is, don't look for mentors in the acceptable or expected forms, right? I was looking for another Black woman who was doing it in ways that I wanted to do it. And I think that's great. I think you need at least one of those people, right? But for me, that was all I was looking for, or Black men, so that was all I was looking for. And it was hard to find in these spaces, and particularly in higher ed. And so I found mentorship in the most unexpected places. I talked about walking across the valley and this man coming up to me and saying, hey, so he was an older white man. And on surface level, we had nothing in common, but he was my champion for 8 years. Like, that man opened doors for me that I never would have had open if he hadn't been speaking about me in places where I wasn't, right? And so that was so helpful. The other woman, she was an older white woman who just never, she didn't say she was officially my mentor. I worked for her and I saw her interact. She was the director of development at this higher ed institution. And her attention to detail and the way she navigated politics was like nothing else. And so I just watched her, and occasionally she'd be like, I see you watching me, right? And so she'd drop a nugget and then she'd go about. So, but looking for mentorship in unexpected places, I think, is important. And so that would be one thing I tell younger Reverend Williams. The thing I would say to my older self is honor your boundaries. Wow. Honor your boundaries. And when it comes to mentorship, I want a mentor who models that. So that work-life balance is modeled and not just talked about. Like, because I need to figure out how to do that and how to do that well, how to lead well and still have time for your family and still, go on those vacations and still like holistically take care of yourself. And so those are the things that I'm looking for as I approach 50, right? It's like, okay, like I want to do this for as long as I can. How do I do it well? And how do I steward these gifts well?
Wow. Thank you, Reverend Williams, so much for sharing that. This has been a great conversation. I appreciate you taking time out to give light to your experience and some experiences that other women, that Black women in particular, have been working in higher education. I'm sure our audience have learned a lot, as well as I on today, from you, and I appreciate that. Just a few moments, just tell us some things that you are working on. You talked about your book. You talked about some of the things that you are doing now. Just let our audience know a little bit more about your book, or if there's another project that you may be working on. So if you can talk a little bit about what you're doing now, things that's going to happen in the future, that would be great.
Okay. Well, so wrote this book, the Diversity Playbook. And one of the reasons why we wrote this book is because we saw younger professionals coming up behind us who were making the same mistakes we had already made, right? And we wanted to say, okay, wait a minute. There are people who have gone before you. There are people who have these answers. You don't have to make the same mistakes. And so really we wrote it, our heart was for that younger diversity professional. And so we have a glow retreat that happens every year. We had to postpone our first one because of scheduling issues. But I want to just say, if you are new to the world of diversity, equity, and inclusion, we want to invite you to this retreat. It really is about self-care. It's about empowerment. It's about networking. So it'll take place in May this year. If you follow, I'll give you our website. So if you follow, we'll be able to give you details about that. But really, it is, our heart is for making sure that people are equipped and are able to sustain themselves in this work, because it's hard work. And so being able to know your boundaries and be empowered and equipped is so important.
Great, thank you. And the book is called?
The Diversity Playbook, Recommendations and Guidance for Christian Organizations. It is currently out now. Would love for you to pick it up, and we're always looking for feedback. So connect with us on our socials to let us know how that's impacting you.
And they can find you on what social media platforms?
You can find me on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram, on LinkedIn, and www.diversity/playbook.com.
All right. Thank you so much for giving us those links. We want to stay connected to you. And now, if you don't mind, make room for me as I give some closing thoughts. Congresswoman Shirley Chisholm was a phenomenal leader from New York City. She was the first Black woman to run for president in the United States. She was quoted saying, "If they don't give you a seat at the table, bring a folding chair." When leading as a minority, there may be times when innovation will be key to your breakthrough. Sister Shirley continues to speak to us on today. Maybe we need to bring not only our chair, but there may be times where we have to create a whole new table for us to thrive as we lead in the 21st century. Until next time on Make Room, I'm your host, Kenneth Young. Thank you for tuning in.